She came through the back pasture at first light, her wedding dress already torn at the hem from the fence she had climbed over, the white fabric grey with dew and field dirt, and she did not look back once. The dress had been pressed the night before by a woman who had been paid to do it and had done it without warmth, and Verity had stood very still while the woman worked, and had not said anything about what she intended to do in the dark hours before the ceremony. She had said nothing to anyone. There was no one to say it to. Her mother had died 4 years prior of a fever that had gone badly managed, and the only family remaining to her was a distant uncle who had brokered the arrangement with Ellis Marsh in the first place and had considered the matter fully settled once the contract was signed and the date was set. She had known for 6 months that she would run. The knowing had lived in the bottom of her chest like a coal that never went fully cold, warm and steady, through every tea with Ellis's mother and every dinner at his great dark house, where the silverware never matched and the conversation always came back to what he owned. Ellis Marsh was 41 years old and had outlived 2 wives, and seemed to consider this a mark of distinction rather than the thing it actually was. He was not a man who raised his hand in anger. He was something subtler, and in some ways worse, a man who used money the way other men used walls, to keep people where he wanted them, and who smiled in the particular way of a man who has never once in his life had to reconsider a decision because there was always someone softer nearby to absorb the cost. Verity was 22 years old. She had been absorbing costs since her mother died. She ran. The homestead came into view through the morning haze just as her legs began to fail her. A low cabin set against a rise of cottonwoods, a horse pen, a barn with one hinge gone on the door, and a woodpile that had been worked down to its last quarter. She had not known the place was there. She had been following the creek south because south was a way, and the creek had bent past a stand of willows, and the cabin had materialized like something the land had set there without asking anyone's permission. She stopped at the tree line and stood with her hands on her knees and breathed. The wedding dress was ruined beyond any reasonable repair. Her hair, which the paid woman had arranged the previous evening with considerable effort, had come entirely undone. She had no bag. She had left in the dark, with nothing but the clothes she was wearing, and a folded letter in her bodice, that she had written to no one, and that said only, "I am sorry I could not be what the arrangement required." The cabin's single window had the glow of a lamp that had been burning all night or had been lit early, and the front step bore a pair of boots set to one side with the careful placement of a man who has stopped counting on anyone else to move them. Smoke came from the chimney in a thin, straight line. The air was cold and still and smelled of sage and something faintly metallic from the creek. She walked across the open ground, between the willows and the front step. She raised her hand and knocked. The silence on the other side was the silence of a house that has been quiet a long time and does not necessarily welcome interruptions. Then there was movement, slow and deliberate, the sound of a man who moved with something that cost him, and the door opened. He was tall, gaunt in the way of a man who had been through something and had not yet found his way back to full weight. His right leg bore the evidence of an injury that had healed imperfectly, a stiffness at the knee that he carried without apology, as though he had long since made his peace with it and did not require anyone's commentary on the matter. His hair was dark and going to silver at the temples. His face was the face of a man somewhere in his mid-30s, who looked older, not from weakness, but from the particular weathering that comes from having been alone with difficult things. His eyes were grey-green and sharp, and they moved over her in the way of a man who had learned to read situations quickly. The torn dress, the loose hair, the bare hands, the direction she had come from. "Please," she said, "I'm not asking for much. Just until I can sort out what comes next." Lucius Cain looked at her in the cold morning light. "Where did you come from?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Ellis Marsh." Yes, he looked past her across the empty field. The morning was grey and still. "You run away from a wedding," he said. "I did?" Another silence. "Come in," he said, "off the porch." That was the first thing she understood. He pointed her to the chair nearest the stove, and he put a tin mug of coffee on the table beside it, and he returned to the opposite end of the room and stood with his weight on his better leg and looked at her with the flat-measured attention. His name was Lucius Cain. He told her this without warmth, the way a man states a fact that requires stating. He had lived on this land for 3 years. Before that he had been in the army, serving with the cavalry in the campaigns along the northern territories, and before that he had grown up in Ohio and had no particular attachment to the memory of it. He had come west, because west was where a man went when he needed the size of the country to put distance between himself and whatever he was leaving behind, and he had not yet determined whether the distance was sufficient. He said all of this in the flat, economical way of a man who speaks to be understood rather than to be liked. She listened. She drank the coffee, which was strong and black and had been made with no consideration for the comfort of anyone who preferred it otherwise. "I'll send word to Marsh," he said when he had finished explaining himself. She went still. "I'm not going back," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was no question in it. Lucius looked at her. "I am not saying I'm going to force you anywhere," he said. "I'm saying he'll come looking regardless, and I'd rather it was on my terms than his. He'll send men first. He won't come himself. Not until there's an audience." He considered this. "You know him well enough to know that." "I know him well enough to know what I was leaving," she said, and she said it with the particular steadiness of someone who has rehearsed being doubted and has decided in advance not to be moved by it. Lucius was quiet for a time. "My leg goes bad in the cold," he said at last. "I've got half a cord of wood that needs splitting before the next hard frost. There's a ewe penned in the barn that needs tending twice a day. She's near her time. The kitchen is managed badly, and I know it." He looked at her. "Room and board," he said, "until you have somewhere else to go. You stay out of the way of trouble when it comes. If you can't do that, I'll drive you to the next town myself and give you enough coin to start fresh." She looked at this man in his cold, spare house, with his careful distance, and his stiff leg, and his face, that showed nothing it wasn't prepared to show. "All right," she said, "all right. Which part? All of it. I'll stay." He picked up his coffee cup and turned back toward the stove. "Room's off the kitchen," he said. "Your own door." The room was small with a window that faced east, and she could hear the creak from it on still nights. There was a narrow bed with a quilt made by someone with patience and skill, the stitching precise across every inch, and she had looked at it a long time before she lay down on top of it fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until sleep came. She had nothing with her, not her clothes, not her mother's locket, not the small collection of books from her room at the boarding house. She had herself. She was coming to understand. The first morning she laid the fire and had coffee ready before Lucius came through the hall. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove. The coffee, the bread shaped into a loaf waiting for the oven to come to heat. He said nothing. He poured himself coffee and took it to the window and stood looking out at the grey morning on his left leg. She did not fill the silence. She had learned, in the months of navigating Marsh's house, when silence needed filling and when it needed leaving alone, and she applied the same principle here. After a time he said, without turning, "You's quieter this morning." I checked her at first light. "Another few days, I think, you know." "Sheep. My mother kept a small flock when I was a child. Lamb will need watching around the clock when it comes." "I know." He nodded once at the glass. She put the bread in the oven. The days found their shape. She managed the kitchen and barn with a thoroughness that had nothing of performance in it. The work gave her days a structure. The last 6 months had entirely lacked. Something that felt, if not quite like peace, then like the ground floor of it. Lucius moved through the homestead with the economy of a man who has learned to conserve because the body has become a thing that costs. He split wood in short sessions. In the mornings, resting between, he mended the barn hinge on a Tuesday, working slowly, tested it twice when done, and went back inside without comment. He did not talk much. When he did, it was direct and spare, and contained exactly what it needed to contain. She had spent 6 months in a house where words were deployed, like instruments of management, and the sparseness of his was a relief she had not anticipated. One evening he came in from the woodyard and found her at the kitchen table with a scrap of paper and a pencil working through figures in the way of someone doing accounts. He stopped in the doorway. "Marsh's men will ask around the farms on the North Road first," she said without looking up. "They'll spend a day or 2 on that before they widen the search south." He came the rest of the way in and sat across from her. "You've been thinking on this." "I've been thinking on this since I left." He leaned forward and looked at the paper. She had drawn a rough map, the creek, the road, the direction of town, the distances she had estimated. 3 days, maybe 4, she said, before they come this far south. He looked at the map. "What were you before you were Marsh's intended?" he said. She looked up, a woman who learned to figure things out on her own. He looked at her for a moment, with the grey-green eyes that gave nothing away, and then looked back at the map. "We'll post the horse in the barn," he said. "Harder to spot from the road." The lamb came on a Wednesday night, in the quiet hours after midnight when the cold had settled in earnest and the barn smelled of hay and warm animal breath. Verity had been checking on the ewe every 2 hours through the evening, and she was there when it started, and she stayed, working quietly, talking the animal, steady through the hardest of it. Lucius came in at some point with the lamp and crouched near the stall with his good knee against the cold ground, and watched without speaking. The lamb arrived at 1:30 in the morning, small and wet, and immediately determined to stand. Verity sat back on her heels in the loose hay and let out a long, slow breath. The ewe turned to her lamb, and the lamb found its footing, and the lamp threw warm, unsteady light across all of it. Lucius set the lamp on the rail and stood. "Good work," he said. He looked like a man who was not accustomed to saying such things, and had said it anyway. "Thank you for the company," she said. He picked up the lamp and walked back out into the cold, and she stayed a while longer, her hand resting on the top rail, watching the ewe tend to her lamb in the quiet. The days after that had something different in them. Not warmth, exactly, not a softening she could point to, but a slight adjustment in the atmosphere of the cabin, as though something held very tightly had simply, without ceremony, released 1 degree of its grip. She found that he read in the evenings. Not novels, but practical things. A worn copy of a cavalry manual, a land survey document she did not ask about, a periodical from the East, about advances in agricultural equipment. He read with the lamp turned up high and his long legs stretched toward the stove, and his face tilted down to the page with complete attention. She had books of her own that she did not have, and this absence was the one thing about her situation that she found genuinely hard to carry. She did not say so. But one afternoon, she noticed a small shelf above the window with 3 books on it, and she had looked at them from a distance for 2 days before she asked whether they were for reading or for leaving alone. For reading, he said. She took the middle one, a collection of natural history essays, and read it in the evenings at her own end of the room, and he read at his end, and the cabin held its quiet around both of them. It was not nothing, that quiet. She had lived in the noise of other people's agendas for long enough to know the difference between a silence that presses on you and a silence that simply is. They came on the 4th day as she had predicted. There were 2 of them, big men with the careful carelessness of hired muscle, and they rode up the south road in the late morning with the deliberate unhurriedness of men who have been told they have authority on their side. Lucius was at the woodpile when they came. He set the axe down and stood and waited. He had a particular way of standing, weight on the left leg, shoulders level, hands loose at his sides, that gave the impression of a man who was very comfortable and very still, and who might continue being very comfortable and very still for a considerable time. It was, she thought from the kitchen window where she watched, the same quality she had seen in old military men when she was a child, the specific ease of someone who has been in situations worse than this one. "We're looking for a woman," the first man said from horseback. "Came through here maybe 4 days back." "White dress." Lucius looked at him. "Lot of country between here and the Marsh place," he said. "We're checking all the farms south of the creek." "I'm not a farm," Lucius said. "I'm a homestead." "One man. She's about this tall," the man said. "Dark hair. Marsh family's offering a finder's fee." Lucius picked up the axe. Not threateningly, the way a man picks up a thing he was using and intends to go on using. "Can't help you," he said. The men stayed on their horses for a moment, looking at the cabin, looking at the barn. "Marsh is going to hear we been all the way down here," the second man said. "He's welcome to," Lucius said. He looked at the first man. "You planning to get down off that horse?" The first man looked at him. "Then I've got wood to split." He turned back to the woodpile. The men sat for another moment, as though calculating whether the transaction was complete. Then the first one turned his horse, and the second followed, and they rode back up the south road without looking back. Lucius split 4 pieces of wood before he went inside. Verity was at the stove. "They'll tell Marsh there's nothing here," she said. "Probably." He washed his hands at the basin. "He'll send men again when he gets impatient. Or he'll come himself." "He'll come himself eventually," she said. "He'll need the audience." Lucius dried his hands. "Let him come." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things for effect. He said them because they were what he meant. She turned back to the stove. The kitchen was warm. She learned about his leg on a cold Thursday afternoon when she came in from the barn and found him at the table with his pant leg rolled up, working at the knee with the focused attention of a man tending something that regularly needed it. He did not hurry to cover it. He looked up when she came in and looked back down. She hung up her coat. "Shrapnel," he said, without her asking. 1870. The hayfield. I was 26. Cavalry surgeon got most of it. There was a piece too close to the joint to take out safely. And they left it. Some days it's nothing. Cold days, it's something. Does heat help sometimes? She got up and put the kettle on. The army discharged me. On account of the leg, I put in the papers to stay. They said no. Was it the right decision? Theirs. He thought about this with the honesty she was coming to recognize as the central quality of the man. I don't know, he said. Maybe. The leg gets bad. I couldn't do everything I was trained to do. What did you do after? Stayed in the territories, worked as a scout for a survey outfit. Then I came south and found this place, and bought it for what I had. He flexed the knee slowly. There was a woman before. She wasn't interested in following a man to a homestead 40 miles from town. It was an honest decision. He rolled the pant leg back down. I'm not good company, he said. I know that about myself. You are direct, she said. That's not the same thing. You're the only person who's been in this cabin since last March. I know. I don't say that as a complaint. The kettle sang, and she made tea and brought it to the table. 2 cups, set one near his hands. He wrapped both around it and looked at the table a moment. Thank you, he said. They drank in the late afternoon quiet, with the cold pressing at the windows, and neither of them requiring anything more from the moment than what it was. 2 weeks in, she told him the rest of it. She told him about the arrangement, the uncle who had brokered it and called it opportunity, the surface charm of Marsh at dinners that had taken her time to see through. She told him how Marsh had dismissed a cook without wages for a perceived impertinence, how he had struck a stable boy of 16 in front of guests for dropping a bridle, and spoken of it afterward as a matter of discipline. She told him about the night 3 months before the wedding when she overheard Marsh with his solicitor discussing the contract he intended to have her sign after the ceremony, the one that would have put her independent decisions and her access to funds firmly under his approval. Lucius listened with his coffee and did not interrupt, and did not offer sympathy in the form of noise. She told him how she had decided, standing outside a door she had not been meant to hear through, and that she had said nothing and gone to bed and begun to wait for the right dark hour. Lucius was quiet for a long time after she finished. Your uncle, he said at last. He won't come himself. He'll write a letter and present himself as a reasonable man who has been inconvenienced. And Marsh. Marsh will come, she said. He's not the kind of man who lets a thing go when his pride is in it. Lucius set his cup down. Why did you tell me all of this? He said. She looked at him directly. Because you took me in without asking too many questions, and you stood in your woodyard and sent his men away, and you deserve to know what you're standing in front of. He looked at her for a moment. I appreciate the clarity, he said. I thought you might. He was quiet again. I was a cavalry officer, he said. I've had men try to push me off ground before. How did that go for them? Badly, he said. The corner of her mouth moved. He picked up his cup again. I'll put the rifle by the door, he said. There was a morning, around the 3rd week, when she understood that something had shifted between them, without anything having been said. She had been awake before the light and gone to the kitchen for water, and found him already there, standing at the window with a coffee cup and his coat on over his nightshirt, watching the dark the way a man watches, when sleep won't come, and he has stopped fighting it. He heard her and turned. She came in and found a cup, and poured coffee from the pot. Still warm. They stood at opposite sides of the kitchen window, and looked at the dark together. After a while he said, You ever think about where you'd go, if you could go anywhere? She thought about it. There was a woman in the county where I grew up who ran a millinery shop, she said. She owned it herself. She had 2 women working for her, and she had an apartment above the shop, and she kept a cat, and she went to the market on Saturdays, and made her own decisions. That's a good life, Lucia said. You could learn the trade. I've thought about it. He was quiet for a moment. Closest millinery is in Cartwright, 22 miles. She looked at him. He looked at his coffee. He was not a man who dressed things up. She had come to rely on this about him in a way she was only just beginning to understand. "I'm not in a hurry," she said carefully. He looked up. "I know," he said. "I'm just saying, the option exists." She looked at him for a moment in the dark kitchen, with the cold pressing at the glass, and the stove breathing its steady heat. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They finished their coffee. The dark outside the window was beginning to soften at the edge, the slow, reluctant approach of another morning coming in from the east, and neither of them moved to start the day. Some mornings were like that. You held them as long as you could. She began fixing things. Not because she was asked, simply because she was there, and the things needed doing and she had hands. The loose shutter on the south side of the barn that clattered in the wind was first. She found the tools on the workbench and worked until the shutter was solid and silent. Lucius came in from the woodyard, heard the quiet where the clatter had been, found her wiping her hands on a rag. He looked at the shutter. He looked at her. He said nothing. She hung the rag back. "The south corner of the house has a gap at the base of the wall," she said. "Cold comes through it." "I'll do it," he said. He did it the next morning, and when he was done there was no more cold at the base of the south wall. She rehung the trim above the kitchen window, mended the broken bridle on the peg, sorted the kitchen stores and reorganized them, so things stopped going to waste, he noticed. He did not say much about it, but he noticed in the way of a man who has been alone long enough to feel the differences. One evening after supper, he sat at the table with his hands flat on the wood. "The place looks better," he said. "It's a good place," she said from the window. "It just needed some attention." He looked at her with the expression of a man hearing said plainly what he had been thinking, but had not put into words. "Yes," he said. He poured himself a final coffee and stood with his back to the room, and she thought he was more at home in himself than he had been when she arrived. Or perhaps she simply knew him well enough by now to read it. He came on a Wednesday. He did not send men first this time. He came himself, in his good coat and his polished boots, with a young solicitor on a horse beside him, and 2 hired men at a distance. He drove a buggy which was not the vehicle of a man expecting physical resistance, and this told her something. He expected the authority of his presence, and the papers in his solicitor's case, to be sufficient. He expected to find her, small and frightened, and grateful for the option of a graceful retreat. She was in the kitchen when she heard them coming up the road, and she went to the window and looked, and then went to the door and opened it, and stood on the step. Lucius was already outside. He had come off the porch at the sound, and now stood in the yard with his hands loose at his sides and his weight settled, and that particular quality of stillness around him that she had come to know very well. Marsh stepped down from the buggy. He was a big man, broad and well-fed, and he carried himself with the ease of someone who had spent 40 years having rooms arrange themselves around him. He looked at Lucius. He looked at Verity on the step. "Verity," he said, "come down off the step." She did not move. Marsh looked at Lucius. "I don't know who you are," he said, with the particular warmth of a man who considers not knowing someone's name a gesture of condescension. "But this is a private matter. It's taking place on my land," Lucius said. "That makes it my concern. The young woman is under contract." Lucius looked at him. "I know what a contract is," he said. "I also know what a contract isn't." The solicitor cleared his throat. "There is a signed agreement," he said, "for a marriage arrangement dated the 14th of March. In the event of abandonment of the arrangement, There are financial penalties stipulated. What's the sum? Lucius said. The solicitor looked at Marsh. The total in dispute, Lucius said, including any penalties, any fees, any costs your client intends to name. What is the figure? The solicitor stated a number. Lucius was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and went into the cabin. Marsh watched him go. He looked at Verity on the step. You've been foolish, he said not unkindly, in the tone of a man explaining a simple fact to someone who has not yet grasped it. There's no need for any of this. Come home, and we'll call it a matter of nerves, and no more need be said. I'm not coming, Verity said. Marsh's face shifted in a subtle way, the way a man's face shifts when he is revising his understanding of how much force a situation is going to require. You don't have anywhere else to be, he said. I do now, she said. Lucius came back out of the cabin. He had a box in his hands that had the weight of a thing kept carefully. He came across the yard and stopped in front of the solicitor and opened the box. Inside was cash counted out in the particular manner of a man who had done the counting twice. Cover the sum, Lucius said, plus 10% for inconvenience. Call it an accounting for the lady's trouble. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said. Lucius looked at him with the gray-green eyes, and the settled face, and the patience of a man who has been shot at and whose leg still carries the evidence, and who has therefore arrived at a very clear understanding. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Lucius said. I've seen your kind before. You're a man who uses money instead of strength because money doesn't argue back. Marsh was very still. Take the payment, Lucius said. Retire the contract. Go home. And if I don't? Lucius looked at him for a moment. You've got 2 men back there, he said. I've been outnumbered before. The 2 hired men at the rear had not moved, but they had the look of men who were recalculating. The solicitor had the look of a man who wished he had taken a different case. Marsh looked at the money in the box. He looked at Verity on the step. He looked at Lucius. He looked at his hired men. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached out and took the money. He gave a signal to the solicitor, who produced a paper and marked through the relevant lines and initialed it and held it out to Lucius, who took it and folded it once and put it in his coat. Marsh turned toward his buggy. You've made a considerable mistake, he said without turning around. Lucius watched him go. You're not the first man to tell me that, he said. Marsh climbed back into the buggy, and the solicitor mounted his horse, and the 2 hired men turned their horses, and they went up the road, and the dust settled, and the morning returned to itself. Verity stepped down from the step and came across the yard. She stood in front of him. That was the money you'd been putting aside, she said. He looked at her. Yes, for the ranch. Yes, she was quiet. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'll pay you back. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. She looked at him. This man who had been alone so long that he had stopped expecting company, who had opened his door on a cold morning to a woman in a ruined dress and given her coffee in a room with a lock on the door and no expectations attached, who had sent hired men away and stood in his own woodyard without once making her feel like she was the problem, who had just spent 2 years of careful saving to stand between her and a man who believed that money made a person property. Lucius, she said. He waited. She was 22 years old, and she had been absorbing costs for a long time, and she was not, at this particular moment, interested in being cautious. I would very much like to stay, she said, not as the arrangement. Not as room and board. I'd like to stay. He looked at her in the morning light with the same gray-green eyes and the same quiet face. and for a moment she could not read him at all. Then something shifted in him, not dramatically, nothing performed, but the careful holding that had been in him since she arrived gave one full, deliberate degree more. "I'd like that too," he said. The word was simple and complete, and it landed the way honest things land. The days that followed had the quality of things settling into their right places. She wrote to her uncle a short letter, correct and final, informing him that the arrangement had been discharged and she was well and would not require his assistance going forward. She did not expect a reply, and she did not receive one, and this absence registered as exactly the relief it was. Lucius rode to Cartwright on a Friday and came back with a small satchel of supplies, and tucked under his arm a paper bag that he set on the kitchen table without comment. She opened it and found inside 3 books, 2 practical, and 1 a collection of poetry, by someone she had not read before, but had seen referenced in the natural history essays. She looked at him. "Thought you might like something different," he said. She did not say anything. She put her hand flat on the top book and felt the weight of it. "Thank you," she said. He went to the stove. She read the poetry that evening at her end of the room, lamp turned up, and at some point became aware that he had stopped reading and was looking out the window, and there was, in the quality of the room around them both, something that had not been there before. The lamb had grown quickly and moved through the pen with the confidence of a creature who had come into a good situation and intended to make the most of it. Verity had given it a name, Mercy, and not mentioned this, it being slightly absurd to name a lamb after an abstract quality. But one morning, he had the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth. "You named it," she said. "I heard you," he said. He gave the lamb a handful of grain from the bucket. "It's a good name." Spring came with its particular unhurried certainty, the cold breaking gradually by degrees, the sage taking on new color, the creek running faster with the snow melt from the hills. She found a patch of ground on the south side of the cabin that got enough sun for a kitchen garden, and she asked Lucius if he minded, and he said he did not mind, and she planted it on a Saturday in early April with seeds she had found in the general store in Cartwright on their second trip. They had gone together, the second trip. Neither of them had made mention of this change from the first trip. They had simply both gotten their coats on at the same time and walked to where the horse was saddled. The town watched. Towns always watched. She had spent enough time being watched by towns to know the difference between malicious scrutiny and ordinary noticing, and she did not require it to be otherwise. When the woman at the dry goods counter asked whether she had gotten settled, she said yes, and meant it. The question of the millinery in Cartwright came up again one evening in May. She had been thinking about it seriously for some weeks. She had practical skills. She could sew and manage accounts and talk to people in the direct way that made them feel heard rather than managed, and the woman who ran the shop in Cartwright was old, and her daughters had gone east, and she had mentioned both times they had visited. He told Lucius this. He listened. "The ride is manageable," he said. 2 days a week, maybe 3 once you're established. It would take time to build. Most things do. I'd be keeping money of my own, she said carefully, not as a challenge, as a thing that was simply important to her. Good, he said without hesitation. A person should have money of their own. I'm going to go speak to the woman in Cartwright, she said. I know, he said. I figured you'd get around to it. The corner of her mouth moved. He refilled his coffee. Outside, the evening was warm, and the garden was coming in green along the south wall, and the lamb called once from the pen in the particular way that meant it wanted attention. And the light through the kitchen window was the long, warm gold of a May evening in country that has a lot of sky. The proposal, when it came, was not what novels would have suggested it should be. It was a Tuesday morning in June, and she was in the garden with her sleeves rolled and her hands in the earth, and he was mending a section of fence at the edge of the property, working steadily, and at some point she became aware that he had stopped and was walking toward her. She looked up. He stopped a few feet away and stood with his hat in his hands. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "I'm not a man who makes a good case for himself," he said. "I know that. I'm not easy company, and I'm not given to demonstrations, and the leg gives out in the cold, and I'm 40 miles from the nearest town." She set her trowel down. "But I think you know all of that already," he said. "You've been here 3 months, and I don't think there's anything about the situation I haven't shown you." He looked at his hat. "I would like very much to marry you," he said, "if you want that. I'm not asking because of the arrangement, or because of Marsh, or because of anything, except that you're the person I want to have in this house, and I would like it to be for good." She sat back on her heels in the garden with the warm morning around them, and looked at this man, gaunt and careful and quietly remarkable, who had taken her in without conditions and given her space and stood in her way when it counted, who read in the evenings and named the lamb before admitting he had been listening for the name, who had told her honestly about his leg and his failures, and the woman before, and the army, and all of it without once making any of it into a performance of suffering. She stood up. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He let out a breath, quiet and slow, the breath of a man releasing something he had been carrying with great care for a considerable time. He put his hat back on. She had dirt on her hands, and she offered him the clean backs of her wrists, and he took one of them and held it, and they stood in the garden in the morning light, with the horse shifting in the pen and the lamb calling once from the far end of the property. It was a warm, ordinary Tuesday in June, on a homestead 40 miles from the nearest town, and it was the best moment either of them had had in a very long time. Verity rode in on Tuesdays and Thursdays through the summer and fall, learning the stock and the books and the particular preferences of the women who came in from the surrounding farms, and by October the old woman had put her name on the sign above the door as a partner and said she intended to sleep past 6 in the morning for the first time in 23 years, and had kept her word about it. The wedding was quiet, in the way they were both suited to. The justice of the peace in Cartwright, a witness who was the woman from the millinery shop, and lunch afterward at the only restaurant in town where the food was unremarkable, but the window had a good view of the hills. Lucius had worn his good coat and his best boots. She had made herself a dress from fabric she had chosen, herself a warm rust brown that suited the season and that she would go on wearing for years because it was practical and she liked it, and that was sufficient reason. The winter was colder than the one before it, but the cabin had been better prepared for it, the gap at the south wall long since filled, the wood stacked high, the larder organized and well stocked, and the cold when it came was simply the cold, a thing to be managed and set at a distance by a warm stove and company that made the distance easy. Her uncle wrote in November, correct and uninvested, the adjustment of expectations made formal on paper. She wrote back in the same register, and thought of it very rarely after that. Marsh did not write, and did not come, and was not spoken of. She had no particular feeling about his absence, She had spent enough of her energy on him already and had other things to spend it on. The garden on the south side of the cabin had produced beyond what she anticipated, and she had spent 2 evenings in August putting up preserves in jars lined along the kitchen shelf. Lucius came in from the woodyard and stood looking at them, and then at her with the expression of a man confronting evidence of a good decision. She handed him the testing spoon. He tasted the peach preserve with appropriate gravity, nodded once, set the spoon back. "Good," he said. She put the lid on the jar. Mercy, the lamb grown into her own ewe, and joined by 2 others, had identified Verity's voice as the voice of a person who carried grain. The pen required careful navigation every morning, a matter that had become a consistent source of what might fairly be called, between the 2 of them, enjoyment. He taught her to ride properly in the spring, a practical matter given the distance to Cartwright. She applied herself with the same thorough attention she brought to most things, and was a competent, confident rider by April. He taught her to shoot one Saturday in the south field. She was a good shot, he said so plainly, and she felt the compliment land the same way. The books on the shelf had multiplied over the year, some hers, some his, and they had taken to reading aloud some evenings. He read well, direct without affectation, pacing himself to the sense of the text. She told him so, and he looked at her with a slightly puzzled expression of someone receiving a compliment about a thing they had never thought remarkable. "I just read it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it good." The homestead settled into its right form, the form of a place occupied by people who intended to stay and whose intentions showed in everything. On cold evenings when the leg gave him trouble, she sat near him, and they read, and the stove did its work, and the world outside was very far away, and the cabin was warm. He had stopped being alone in a way that cost him. She had stopped running from a life she had not chosen. It was, by any honest measure, enough. People in Cartwright asked sometimes in the careful, oblique way of a small town that wants to know without appearing to ask directly. The woman whose name was now beside Verity's on the millinery sign had the full accounting told directly. One quiet afternoon in November, when the shop was empty and the question had been asked plainly enough to deserve a plain answer. She had not been fleeing Marsh's money. There were women who would have been glad of the match, who would have looked at the house and the silver and the position and concluded that the rest was manageable. She understood the arithmetic. But she had looked at Ellis Marsh across enough dinner tables to know what she was being asked to walk into, the quiet, constant erosion of a life spent being accommodated rather than considered, present as a function rather than as a person. She had been fleeing the self she would have had to become to survive it. She had run in a wedding dress across a frost-wet field at first light and knocked on a stranger's door, and the stranger had opened it. This was the part that still struck her in the middle of ordinary days. A man in a cold house who had no reason to take in a runaway had opened his door and said, "Come in off the porch." He had not asked whether she deserved it. He had not weighed her need against his convenience. He had simply made room. She thought of this when she was riding the road to Cartwright, with the light coming in long from the east, the kind of morning that makes the country look exactly as good as it is. The thing that had changed was not the money or the freedom or the homestead with its garden and its lamp in the window. The thing that had changed was that someone had looked at her situation honestly and made room without conditions. She had tried to be that for him. In return, he would say, being who he was, that he had gotten the better end of it. She would say he was wrong about that. They were both right. On a morning in the second spring, she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee cup and watched Lucius in the yard below. He was working at the fence line where the lamb, Mercy the oldest, the matriarch now, had found a weakness and was monitoring the situation with the interested attention of a creature evaluating options. Lucius was talking to the ewe, in the low, practical voice he used with the animals, steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who has long since made his peace with the idea that talking to animals in the morning is a reasonable way to start a day. The light was the early warm gold of a May morning. The garden was showing its first green at the south wall. The satchel of paperwork for the millinery sat on the kitchen table where she had left it the night before. She stood at the window and drank her coffee. She was 24 years old, which felt, from where she stood now, like the beginning of things. She had run from a wedding and knocked on a stranger's door, and the stranger had opened it, and the whole course of everything had changed. She had not been looking for a rescue. She had not been waiting for someone to fix what was wrong. She had known what she needed, and she had gone to find it, and what she had found had been better than she had allowed herself to imagine. Lucius came in from the yard and stamped his boots on the step, and closed the door behind him, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the satchel. He looked at her. "You're going to Cartwright today," he said.
"This afternoon,"
she said. "Back before dark." He crossed to the stove and poured coffee and stood beside her at the window and looked out at the yard where Mercy was conducting a fresh evaluation of the fence situation. "She's going to be through that fence by Thursday," he said. "I know. I'll fix it tomorrow." "All right." They stood at the window together, and the morning came in, gold through the glass, and the yard was bright, and the hills beyond were green, and the country went on and on in every direction, wide and clear, and full of the kind of space that makes a person feel if they are standing on the right ground. She put her free hand on the window-sill. He was standing close enough that his arm was a warmth beside her, and neither of them said anything about it. There was nothing to say. It was enough to be there, in the kitchen in the morning, with the coffee and the light and the particular quiet of a house that has been made into a home by two people who chose it deliberately and kept choosing it every day. This has been the story of Verity, who ran from a wedding she had never agreed to in her heart, and Lucius, who opened his door on a cold morning and made room, and the homestead in the cottonwoods that became the place they both, at last, intended to stay. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and let me know. And if you want more stories like this one, please like and subscribe. There are more coming, and every one of them is about the kind of ordinary courage that doesn't get written into history books, but changes everything, one cold morning at a time.